Hi, this is Professor Nexon, and this is the Constructivism mini-lecture for Government 006, brought to you courtesy of new Internet and web-based technologies. Now, what I want to do today is I want to complete where we left off in terms of what I was discussing about, broadly speaking, constructivist theory. We talked about what it means to say that something is socially constructed, the notion of social facts, that is, social institutions and beliefs that have no reality outside of our subjective understandings of them, and yet present themselves as if they were an objective part of reality, and in many ways do function for individuals as if they were objectively given, even though they only persist by virtue of some residual of common beliefs about them. I talked in the supplement that I posted before this mini-lecture about typifications and representations, and the way that in constructivist theory, typifications, representations mediate the world, determine what we think is significant, help to us to catalog and categorize the world such that it affects how we interact with it, what our rules of thumb are for how we ought to behave given certain kinds of situations, and so on and so forth. I also talked a little bit about the constructivist critique of anarchy, that is, the notion that anarchy is socially constructed, that anarchy only exists by virtue of an intersubjective norm of appropriateness surrounding sovereignty, and even if you don't necessarily buy that argument, and as we go forward we'll look at some of the debates about whether anarchy really is kind of independent of the existence of sovereign territoriality, or we can talk about anarchical systems that aren't governed by sovereign territorial logics, but also the notion that anarchy is, in Wendt's terms, what states make of it, that the culture of anarchy, the intersubjective meanings and norms associated with any given international system, might profoundly shape political behavior in that system. I want to extend that notion right now by going in a little bit more into detail about Alex Wendt's insight about how identity and collective identification plays an important role in determining how the dynamics of anarchy will play out. Now, this is a very standard representation, the type we've been using, of anarchy. That is, we have billiard balls existing, bouncing around off each other, differentiated only by their relative size. Now, you notice that these entities are only differentiated by power. That is, they have no forms of functional differentiation. We've talked about functional differentiation in terms of, for example, economic specialization, and the notion in realist theory that the states that survive and prosper tend to recognize the imperatives of self-help and not hyper-specialize such that they're able to defend themselves and provide basic welfare and public goods to their citizens on their own recognizance. But another dimension of differentiation relates to social roles in any given system or any given field of interaction. We talked a little bit about this when I gave a family example, that social roles shift over time in the American family, such that the role of father doesn't have precisely the same meanings and implications that it may have had in the Victorian era, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the insights that constructivists have, and that Wendt really pushed forward, was that realism does actually contain, arguably, an assumption about role specialization, about role differentiation. And that assumption, as we see in this slide, is that states are differentiated by their identities. And you think about the nation-state system, where each state is supposed to represent a particular nation or has a kind of national identity or form of nationalism, such that we represent this in this slide by different colors, but there's a French national identity which is imperfectly coterminous with the French state, or an American national identity, and that people in a nationalist system identify with their nation, which ideally in a nation-state system is the state. Now, we all know, and we'll look more closely later on at ethno-nationalist conflict, but we all know that nations don't actually break up perfectly along states, and this has broad implications for civil wars and even interstate conflict. Nonetheless, there's a kind of baseline assumption that the locus of identity is coterminous with the boundaries of the state. Now, Wendt argued, both based on sort of analytical and logical reasoning, but also you could develop a whole set of historical examples of this, and Wendt talks about some of them, but argues that over time the interaction of states, for a variety of different reasons, as a result of a variety of different mechanisms and processes, population flows, histories of convivial or conflictual interaction, might develop some facets of collective identification that extend beyond state boundaries and include other states or the populations of other states, so that you may develop situations in which there are layered collective identities that transcend state boundaries, that are supranational, or that include multiple different states and exclude other ones. So you develop we groups or us notions of us that may include a community of states and exclude other states or other communities of states. Common examples of this might include the gradual development, particularly since 1945, of a notion of European identity, or in some respect Western European identity, but also European identity more broadly, which sort of says that the French, the English, the Germans, whatever their differences, are kind of members of the same overarching community. Or if you think about a lot of common discourse in contemporary politics, notions of civilizational identity, Western civilization, Islamic civilization, Chinese civilization, that may or may not transcend the boundaries of states and provide a source of, may represent a set of common values or a common set of collective identities and norms that include populations in different states. Now, why is this important? Well, there's a huge amount of historical and psychological and social-psychological evidence that people show in-group bias. That is, that they show favoritism to those for whom they perceive as being members of the same categorical identity. So that people, for example, in experiments asked to distribute resources, candy, for example, will give proportionally more candy to people, to use this analogy, to people who they see as like them, and less to people who they see as not like them. This is a very robust finding. Even in cultures that show very low levels of xenophobia, that are very welcoming to outsiders, you still detect very subtle forms of in-group bias. People are more likely to trust people if they see them as like them. People are more likely to favor them in the allocation of resources, and so on and so forth. Think about partisan identity in the United States. Republicans, when they see other Republicans talking on camera, say on a smackdown kind of crossfire scenario, or in the news media otherwise, sort of have an implicit sort of a rule of thumb that they're more likely to trust what they hear coming from Republican sources than explicitly Democratic sources. Same is true as Democrats. Democrats are much more likely to trust people who self-identify as Democrats on political issues than Republicans. This can get quite extreme, where you have people who don't believe anything Bush says precisely because he's a Republican and they're Democrats. People who didn't believe anything Clinton said because they were Republicans, and so they were predisposed to distrust members of an out-group. You'll see this at sporting events, where people with nothing in common will go to a sporting event, and they'll behave more favorably for people who are supporting their own team than people who are supporting the other team. In extreme forms, you can get riots between rival fans, so-called soccer hooligans. So if we can extend this, and there's reason to believe we can, to the international community, we would, or the international system, would expect that states that come to, in their populations, when they come to collectively identify with another on, civilizational grounds, or on regional grounds, or on, say, English-speaking, the Atlantic community, English-speaking grounds, the Anglophone community, whatever you want to, look as your relevant community, may show in-group favoritism, in-group bias, may be predisposed to be less giving or less likely to believe outsiders. And so you can get then different cultures of anarchy that have to do with the degree and the pattern with which states and their populations collectively identify with one another. And you can imagine that in the extreme you might form what are called security communities, groups that collectively identify with each other strongly enough that they no longer see war as a reasonable way to solve their disputes. These people are like us, they share our values, we should resolve our disputes peacefully. As a footnote,